the Cannabis Business Coach.
Hi, Mike Z here, author of the Cannabis Business Book, and you're listening to the Cannabis Business Coach podcast, where I chat with and coach the highest performing entrepreneurs in the cannabis industry.
Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is the Cannabis Business Coach.
Hi, Mike Z, aka Professor Z here, and on this episode of the Cannabis Business Coach podcast, I'm really excited to have my dear friend and colleague, David Paleschuck. He's the founder and CEO of Branding Bud Consulting Group, as well as a best-selling author and a professor at LIM College, where he teaches our graduate students cannabis marketing. So they get to learn from the best of the best, truly. And Dave, I'm super excited to have you here. You've become a great friend over the years, and I always love our conversations. And so thanks for being here, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm
Yeah,
excited.
my pleasure, my pleasure. So to kick off, I'll ask, as I always do, about your cannabis origin story, because I know your background well, but for the folks at home who may not know Dave, you had a very successful career in mainstream branding and marketing. You worked at American Express, MasterCard, Pepsi, Microsoft. You worked with all these Fortune 500 big name brands and then made the transition to cannabis. And you got into this thing early. So tell me about that. How and why did you make that transition?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me. And really, that question is a funny question to me because as much as I've spent many years, decades at all those companies, I never quite fit in. Um, so I always knew I was an outsider. Prior to that, and prior to getting my MBA, I had owned an art gallery and studied art and design at Parsons School of Design. So yeah, just always being an outsider, and I think, and a skateboarder as well. So those things lead up or often are connected to cannabis. And so I've been connected to cannabis for a good part of my life. Always felt its presence around individuals that I respected in terms of creativity and independence and free thinking, alternative thinking. So yeah, it's just always been around. But that said, one thing which really stands out, and I'll never forget, it was in the 70s. My brother was arrested with a group of his friends, and they had one joint, which was half gone, and they were in the woods, having fun. They were in high school, and I remember that was the first time I ever saw my father cry, was because my brother was arrested and put in jail overnight for cannabis. So as much as there's good, there's bad. My goal, my objective is to normalize and standardize and really push for the acceptance of cannabis.
So, and I guess I'm curious to hear how your experience, two-part question, how your experience in mainstream branding and marketing influenced your approach in cannabis, where you've helped develop some pretty prominent brands as well. And I guess the second part would be how are those two industries, how are your experiences different in mainstream traditional corporate America versus in the cannabis industry?
Wow. Well, I don't think we have enough time really to cover everything. But well, let's start off. I got into the industry 13 years ago when on the day basically the I-502 law passed in Washington State, which is the adult use cannabis law, same day that Colorado passed. So it was a big day. And I left. I ended up getting a job at Dope Magazine, where I was the vice president of brand licensing and partnerships. And I just met everybody in the industry. And that was at a time where pretty much everything was flower. So everything was really about the cultivators. Everything was really about flower, quite frankly. And then over the course of time, over the next few years, it was really about what do we do with flower? How can we turn that into different form factors. Then the edibles came in, then the beverages came in, et cetera, et cetera. Transdermal patches, sublingual slips, all the different form factors. So once that started to happen, then it was clear that these brands were starting to take cues from consumer packaged goods. If there was a transdermal patch with THC or CBD or other cannabinoids, it was obvious they were putting that patch into something that looked like a Band-Aid or a Nicorette type package, right? And they were using cues that we were all used to, and rightly so. Why build new models when models exist already? Side note, that's what I always say when it comes to terpenes. Terpenes have everything to do with aromatherapy, right? Lavender is filled with linalool. Linalool is typically falling into the more indica or sedative benefits of the plant, right? The opposite is true with limonene and pinene on the more uplifting. So even the models we use to think about and talk about cannabis is really interesting. But it's all coming from things we know. And the same with packaging. Sure, rules and regulations are really what's driving the packaging. But at the end of the day, we as consumers understand child-resistant packaging. We understand Mylar bags. We understand et cetera, right? All the different form factors. So I think early on it was a bag of weed, right? A bag of flour. Now where we are is very elegant, very upscale packaging and pretty highly technical form factors. So it's changed certainly over the last 13 years, like amazingly. And now to your second question, which is like, how does the real world differ from the cannabis world? In some ways, it's the same. We all have to develop products, and we have to name those products and brand those products and talk about the benefits of those products. In the real world, sometimes those benefits are more clear and more scientific. In the cannabis space, you could actually sell the same product, the same flower, for example, or the same form factor. One can be marketed as an uplifting product that you want to take before a hike or before you go bowling or paint a photograph or create music. That same product could be marketed to somebody that wants to alleviate pain, sleep, or fall asleep, for example, or alleviate some body pain. And the interesting thing is I often talk about these things as additive and subtractive in terms of how we approach it. So I'll ask a brand owner, who are you appealing to and what is their need? And do they have a ritual related to this need? So again, getting into the mindset and the state of consumption. That happens very differently for someone who wants to fall asleep than it is for somebody who wants to go on a hike, right? And those might be the same products, but you market them differently to different people. Further, the rules and regulations are always changing in the cannabis space. So when you really think about, a runway for really developing a product and introducing that product, whether it's a consumer product good or otherwise, in the real world, you have a real ramp to do that and a runway to do that. In the cannabis space, well, sure, you might have that time, but the chances are you don't because everything's changing all the time.
For sure. And you touched on some of the differences between cannabis and the mainstream. And, you know, I gotta say, I'm still shocked today when I talk to a lot of cannabis brands and executives, and, when I ask them what is like a marketing 101 question of, who's your target audience? Who's your target demographic? Who's your ideal customer profile? And I still am surprised by how often I hear, these like really non-answer answers of like, oh, everyone, or like connoisseurs, or like, these generic kind of answers that have no real data or research behind them. So I love the way that you break it down. And of course, this is all in your book, Branding Bud, which is quite literally the textbook of many cannabis marketing classes, not just at LIM College, but at other schools as well, and is, you know, kind of the authoritative book on cannabis marketing and branding, where you talk about these use cases and the profiles and all this stuff, which I think, and even the archetypes of the different consumers, which I think is so valuable. So um, couldn't endorse that book more highly. But I want to ask you along those lines, what is, because I know you and I have spoken about this kind of in our own off the record musings and conversations of um, branding is much more than just a logo. And a lot of people, especially in cannabis, I feel like this isn't the case in the mainstream as much, but maybe in the startup space and startup industries like cannabis, people have that misconception.
Mhm.
Um, would you say that's the most common misconception you encounter, or what might be the most common misconception as it relates to cannabis branding?
Yeah, well, a few things. So, so let's just talk about what perspective we're talking from. So I would just say a brand owner's perspective, like what do I see as potential clients and clients come to me. So yeah, the first thing, like you just said, is when I ask that same question, who is your client? They'll say, who's your customer? They'll say everybody, or we don't know. And it's usually those two. So the first one is if it's everybody, which it's not, and I say it's not because it's 21 and above, and et cetera, right? You know, when you start down that whole line. But also if you don't know who it is, who do you want it to be? And that's really tough. And typically, more than anything, people are sort of like, they want the hoity-toity upscale client, right? You know, like because that's what they want their brand to be. And there's been a big move and a big push toward, um, you know, cannabinoids and adaptogens and beverages, and everybody is trying to upscale cannabis, right? But you know, the truth is, um, there are different types of people that consume cannabis, number one, and there are different reasons why they consume cannabis, number two. And I could go down the list. And actually, I talk about this in creating a meaningful cannabis brand. You know, there's three, essentially four pillars, but the different pillars, right? You start off with the customer. Who's the customer? What do they want? What's their demographics? What are they looking to achieve? Again, additive, subtractive. Do they want to go to sleep? Do they want to go on a hike? What do they think about the packaging? What sort of form factor, right? And you start to peel that away. So, do they consume discreetly or not? Well, if they consume discreetly, then burning flower is out of the question, right? Because they don't want to smell like cannabis. So that's out of the question. And little by little, if you figure out what their need states are, when and how they consume cannabis, if it's discreet or indiscreet, you figure out the form factor. Once you figure out the form factor, and you know if the consumer is inhaling, ingesting, or putting topical on their skin, then you figure out the dosing, right? And so, and then finally you get to the last pillar, which is really the brand archetype. So is it a celebrity brand? Is it a charity brand? Is it a novelty brand? Is it a nostalgia brand? And more often than not, I've called out in my book 14 cannabis archetypes, but more often than not, they're combined. They're not just one or the other. So let's just take the brand Whoopi and Maya. It's Whoopi Goldberg, so it's a celebrity brand. It's a female-based brand, so it's a gender-based brand. They also have a charity component, so there's a cause and charity component. But basically, different brands speak to different people. So think about charity and cause. 40 tons, justice joints, the farmer and the felon. I could keep going, right? You know, these are the brands that people buy who really want to give back to the community and really feel deeply about that their spending power goes into things they believe. And so you know, there are foodie brands. Think Kiva, think Can, perhaps. It just depends. Value-based brands. So all these different brand types are really attracting all these different brand consumers. We also saw during the pandemic value when cannabis was deemed essential and cannabis dispensaries was deemed essential. There were value brands that came out. Baker came out. Old Pal came out. There were a number of others which were, buy cannabis in um, larger quantities where you didn't have to go to the dispensary every day or every week or whatever it was with a greater value. People weren't working, people didn't want to leave their home. So, brand types and brand archetypes not only reflect culture, but also reflect what's happening at a point in time in society. So I would also expect that brand archetypes will over time change and evolve.
Got it. And let me ask you a quick follow-up question there, because again, from my experience, even when I went to like Hall of Flowers, let's say, where you see, you know, a lot of brands, and from the high end to the big famous ones to new up and coming ones, full spectrum of brands, pun intended. Um, I've found that it's very difficult and they struggle with communicating the differentiation. And, maybe I'm a little jaded here as a longtime consumer and industry person, that this is a commodity and it's hard to differentiate. At least I've come to view it as such recently. But from your standpoint, from a brand owner standpoint, from a business building standpoint, how can these companies and brands actually differentiate in such a competitive market?
Well, that's a great question. And it just comes back to the question, how are they appealing to their target audience and their reality customer, right? Who they want their customer to be and who their customer is are two different things. Well, not always. If they're doing the right job, they're matching. But there are a couple of brands that really strike me as smart and clever. And I'll tell you why. So the first one I'll call out is Fish Whistle. And Fish Whistle is so great because Fish Whistle is the slang name for what anglers, fishermen and women call a joint. So when they go out fishing and they smoke, they always say, "Hey, do you have a fish whistle?" or "Light that fish whistle up," etc. What's amazing about this, when you think about it, is so fishing and smoking uh, are both ritualistic. They're both things that people really seek to do and often do together. So think about this. This company has not only really targeted who their consumer is, they've targeted what they do pretty much and potentially where they do it when they do it. Um, you know, they're angling, they're fly fishing, they're doing this in certain spots that are well known for that. There are events tied to that. So now what this company has done is they've created not only their product, their flower and their pre-rolls, but they've also shown up at angler events and fishing events where they have a line of apparel, and everybody gets the inside joke because they know what a fish whistle is. So they buy the equipment, they buy the apparel, they do all this other stuff. And now not only are they selling cannabis in dispensaries, but they're also selling a line of branded apparel in the mass market. So they've really taken sort of that honing in on who they're speaking to another level. Another brand is called Heavy Grass. Heavy Grass is a brand that flower, nothing really special or different in that, but who's their target audience? Heavy metal folk, right? So where do they show up? Well, they show up selling merch at all the heavy metal on all the heavy metal tours. And what's great about that is they know who their customers are and they know where they're going to show up. just look at, just look at the concert tours and you're like, all right, where's Metallica? I know, I'm sorry, that's probably a stereotype at this point, but like, what's the Metallica tour doing this year in 2025? How do we tie on to that? How do we go sell our merch at Metallica concerts to get the metalheads totally into our metal weed brand, right? So again, they know who the target customer is. They know the language to speak to that customer. They know where to meet them, what events, where they'll be, how to look, how to, all the other things, what products they're interested in, how to serve everything up that they want, the heavy metalers or the anglers, right? So those two brands are really great examples in my mind of where cannabis brands go deeper, way deeper than most any other brand that's celebrity based, or it's just, the brand of the month or that sort of thing. Some celebrity was caught smoking it or something happened and they got the right PR firm and the right connections or the right investors. But these companies go a little bit further because they understand the community that they're serving. They understand how to speak the language to that community, and they understand how to offer something up that's of value. And whether it's of value or not, maybe it's perceived value, right? There's perceived value and real value, but that's what they're offering up. And that's why those brands are successful.
Love that. That's awesome. Never heard of those brands. Love those two examples. Makes
You
me
will.
makes me think we could start a brand, Oy vey Jays, for neurotic Jews. No, just kidding. But but no, the what I love these examples and these stories, and to me it really, captures not only this whole identity and really targeting a specific community, but also I've heard so many brands that are like, we're a lifestyle brand and we cater to this life, but they don't actually cater to anyone. And, like the example you gave there, like everyone, but these two brands that you just talked about truly found, you know, a lifestyle or a subset of cannabis smokers or cannabis consumers who have these other strong, you know, hobbies, rituals, identities, whatnot, and have leaned into, okay, fishing. So we're going to be at all the fishing events, and at the end of the day, it's really, I think, as you said, the perceived value of, and what is that perceived value? It kind of just affirms the consumer's choices, right? Or preferences. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. Here's this inside joke or this, cultural thing that I get and this company gets. So I'm going to choose them over the 100 other pre-rolls, for example, because they
Yeah.
get me, right?
Yeah.
So, I, I think it's really, really a great lesson there for anyone who's trying to build a brand. Um, and also, these things apply. We're talking about B2C brands, but even if you're building a B2B brand, right, there's still this kind of intentionality and specificity of being very clear about your why and who and what you're for.
I often talk about this, when I speak to clients or speak to students. And I have a slide, and the slide really breaks down branding and how branding has changed over time. And just super quickly, in the 50s and 60s, branding was really about efficiency and economics, right? So think sliced bread, sliced cheese, miles per gallon. Then when we got into the 70s and 80s, it was more about how a brand made you feel. So now it was miles per gallon instead of miles per hour. It was the ad where I want to say it was either a Bose ad or maybe a BSF ad. I'm not quite sure. There was a guy sitting in a chair in front of a speaker and his hair was blowing back. And that was a famous ad, right? So that was really about how products made us feel. So think a convertible and again the air blowing through our hair. If if we had it. Um,
Remember when we had hair, the good old days, Dave?
That's right. That's right. When those ads appeal to me. And then, excuse me, and then as we moved more into the 90s, into the 2010s, it was really about logo slaps, right? It was almost like Fortnite skins, right? It was pretty much like we wore clothes to create hierarchy or to either include ourselves in certain groups or disengage from certain groups and disassociate from certain groups. So that's kind of where brands were then. And now we've moved into this phase and we've kind of been there for the last probably 10 to 20 years, let's say, which is really about what brands promise and do they actually deliver on their promise. And now we're looking at the ethos of the brands, right? And what they're delivering, and does that sync with our life's perspective and how we live our lives. So think seventh generation, think Patagonia, think Tesla, maybe Tesla before the election. But those types of brands and what they're trying to convey and how people really buy into that. Think Prius maybe instead of Tesla. But you get the point here. And so our relationship with brands has changed, decade by decade by decade, or every 20 years. And again, it that should be no surprise as our society changes and the morals and mores and North Star changes from decade to decade. Therefore, the brands we consume also change.
Yeah, certainly. And I want to shift gears, Dave, because you mentioned the logo slaps, and it
Mhm.
reminded me of, one thing I didn't mention earlier is your experience in the fashion world when you were a big part of the Zoo York brand and building that out. And now, of course, you're teaching at LIM College at the Mark Hughes School of Graduate Studies in our cannabis marketing class. And, for the people listening at home who might not know, LIM traditionally is all about the business of fashion. And so I wanted to ask you, I guess, two things here. One is just a little bit about your experience as a professor and teaching at LIM, and maybe what surprised or impressed you about the students. And then secondly, I want you to speak a little about the connection between fashion and cannabis, which I think sometimes people, when I tell them about the college, they're confused about that. But I think if you really understand cannabis culture, it's very obvious the connection between cannabis and fashion. But I'd love to just hear your take on that.
Wow. Okay. First question is, as a professor, what's my experience and what have I seen? The first thing I just want to call out is, one, we are in a new industry, right? That's just taking off, and has seen lots of slips and pitfalls and trips along the way. So we're growing it all together, And in some ways, I want to say, even though I've been in it 13 years and people have been in it longer than that. In cannabis, every day is a new day. So no matter where you step into the elevator, you could potentially be an expert in some areas very quickly. Um, Conversely to that, it's also not only about the plant and about the business, but in rules and regulations, but it's also about a culture. So there's really a history that really needs to be learned and sort of understood in order to really just understand the guardrails and understand that the respect that's required, to do things correctly, not only with the plant, but with the communities that have surrounded the plant for many years. So, so relative to that, there's great opportunities to learn, to find a lane for yourself in the industry. It's still young, and in that, the thing that I find most interesting and intriguing at LIM and in teaching in particular is that the students are from really all different backgrounds. So coming in to the course, I'm learning also. People ask questions, and I'm like, wow. I never thought about that, or I never thought about that perspective about this topic. So it's really cool as a professor to sort of get that mashup and sort of, get what the students are seeking. Again, the students come from all different backgrounds. Some, I've had students from healthcare, some who are entrepreneurs, some who are business people that want to make a change and a shift in their life, some people that either they themselves or their families have been affected by illness and they've turned to the plant for help. Et cetera, et cetera. There's so many different reasons why people come into the industry or are interested in it. And that's also what makes the industry so exciting and so intriguing. And I always find when people come to the industry from another background, they not only have more to offer the industry, but it's easier for them to find a place within the industry because they're taking their skill set and saying, hey, I could apply this skill set to the industry. And much like me, I was in branding and marketing. I saw a new market and opportunity and industry opening up. And I jumped on it. And there's so many aspects to cannabis. And just even pull back from the plant for a moment. The cannabis industry is just like any other industry, other than it being super highly regulated. The truth is, you know, I don't know, start off with HR. Do they need HR people? Yes, they do. Do they need employees? Yes, they do. What do those employees do? You name it, from sourcing products, through operations, through marketing, through all the things that other businesses do. So, and thank God the business of cannabis at LIM is really what's being taught. It's not just maybe what people would think stereotypically it should be about. It truly is about marketing. That's the course I teach. It truly is about rules, regulations, real estate, all sorts of things that come into play. So I think the school's a great place for students to enter the industry. I think it's a great place for students to make a place for themselves right from the get-go. And I think it's a place, that respects the plant. And one last thought. Years ago, 100 years ago, when I went to Parsons School of Design, one of the first things I was told, just when I was accepted, I had not started yet. I was working at an art gallery, and the wife of the owner of the art gallery was so excited because she had gone to Parsons, and she said to me, "I'll give you one word of advice." She said, "It's not necessarily what you're going to learn, it's who you're going to meet." And so I would say the same exact thing. If you want to be in this industry, going to LIM will put you in classes with other people that want the same thing. And over time, will become the people that you want to know in the industry. And you could say, hey, I knew them from. And you know what? I can't tell you how many times I've done that with Parsons. And I'm not a big alumni guy at all. But the truth is, when you connect with people at a certain point in your life and you're learning and you're growing, that connection stays with you a long time, especially when you have a love for something similar.
100%. And I have had the same thing with my alma mater, Claremont McKenna, where, some of my closest friends that I went to school with are now doing all these remarkable things in venture capital and finance and all this other stuff that it's like invaluable friendships and relationships that, I couldn't have had if I wasn't there with them. But, I'll just share real quick. I had today just one of my favorite moments that I've had since launching the programs at LIM, which is one of my first students from the very first Intro to Cannabis undergrad classes is now in her last semester and doing her capstone project. And she requested to meet with me today and said, "Hey, professor, you know, no offense, but I want to challenge myself and I want something more difficult. And I have a business that I want to build. Can I work on that instead of the assigned project?" And, as a professor, teacher, this was like music to my ears. I was like, couldn't be happier. And so I'm giving her the graduate capstone as opposed to the undergrad class because she wants the challenge and she wants to grow and develop and make impact in the industry. And I just thought, wow, like this is a surreal moment because not only was it one of my first students who's about to now graduate with the bachelor's in business of cannabis, but here she is asking for more work and more of a challenge because she wants to build something that I think is actually seriously needed in the industry. And I won't share her idea, but having to do with eliminating waste and promoting sustainability and all that good stuff. So anyway, I want to go back and ask you about the fashion and cannabis connection and your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of understand that um, cannabis and creativity have come together in so many different ways. I don't think anybody would dispute that fashion is all about creativity, and so that comes together. Um, but I think it comes together in varied ways, almost like that same sort of thing. Who's the cannabis consumer? Well, that's like almost impossible to ask. It's to answer. It's not everyone. We know that, right? But but does it cross socioeconomic uh aspects in our country? Sure it does. Do the rich consume cannabis? Yes, they do. Do the poor consume it? Of course. And across every race. So that said, if cannabis touches everybody, again, I'll do air quotes, almost everybody, how about that, in the ways that it does, why wouldn't it affect us? And so that affects us both culturally, like, hey, we want to be associated with it because it's cool, or I consume it, but I do not want anybody to know that I consume it. That's also right, both something that attracts us and repels us. And thank God there's all the different form factors to allow us to consume discreetly. Um, you know, so so it's interesting. I used to skateboard. I'd roll up to the skateboard park and having red eyes and smelling like weed was, a badge of honor. It was just part of what you did. It was part of the look. It was almost like your dreadlocks if you had them, right? It was that. Um, and then I've been in other places in my life where it's just totally unacceptable. So, so there are different ways to consume it. So that said, how does it come back to fashion, right? It comes back to fashion because it touches our lives in so many ways, and so does fashion, and so does creativity. And I think all those things intersect. Again, I said earlier, I was a professional skateboarder. I had owned an art and design gallery in New York City. Um, many of my friends own fashion businesses and streetwear companies. And the truth is, cannabis intersects on all of those levels, but differently with different people. And so so that's why there are some brands which are counterculture brands and in your face, like a Elevated, about weed. And then there are other brands which are just way more discreet. Um, and so what that comes back to is lifestyle and fashion um, overlap. It's almost like one potentially causes the other, right? Or it's the yin and the yang. What I believe and how I live my life has everything to do with my life's perspective, how I dress, how I look, how I feel, how I express myself. That's where cannabis comes in. And that's why I think these things are totally connected. And that will be clearer over time. I still think the people that don't get it, um, uh, maybe it's just not in focus. But I think over time, I mean, certainly one can say cannabis is a lifestyle unto itself, for those who are deep in it. But then, the lingering wafting uh, smoke that's in the air also, I hate to call it, I hate to use this analogy, but I'll say the secondhand smoke, touches everybody, right? I mean, I could walk into Zoomies and I could see the cookies brand. I could walk into the Croc store and see 420 gibbets, which are or gummies that go on to the Crocs, that or cannabis leaves that go on to the Crocs. So even mass market mainstream brands where 7-year-old kids are walking into the store, they're around this too, and they see this, and that's what I mean by the secondhand smoke. That this affects everybody. It truly is, wafting across society, and how we deal with it, will be seen.
Great. Cool. Thanks. I appreciate your take because I like to think about it as like, you know, both of these worlds of cannabis and fashion have this counterculture and also this mainstream culture element where they have so much influence and they go across whether I like how you framed it as creativity because, the arts and music and all this stuff that they're so heavily intertwined in. And, now from the business standpoint, you know, of course, part of the LIM premise for getting into cannabis was, supply chain management, retail operations, branding and marketing, product merchandising. This all the stuff that we've been teaching on the fashion side for many, many years is all transferable and necessary in cannabis. So but anyway, Dave, I want to shift gears again. I have so many things I want to talk to you about. Unfortunately, we're running out of time soon. I think we're gonna have to do a part two because I still have a bunch of stuff I want to ask you about. But one of the things is about international cannabis. I know you've been doing some work in Thailand. I was hoping you could share a little about, what you've seen there and maybe other markets or just talk about how you see the industry expanding and evolving.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Thailand is pretty incredible in and of itself. The fact that it has a history with Thai traditional medicine that includes cannabis, which was basically during the Vietnam War and after, with the just say no war to drugs. The rest of the world followed the U.S. And perhaps even more stricter than the U.S. Did. But nonetheless, cannabis is now legal legal with strings, I'll say, although those strings are not really enforced in Thailand. I've spent the last 3 years in Thailand, going and being part of the community, and it's incredible. Bangkok has about 12 to 1,300 dispensaries just in the city alone. Now, just to give you a quick example, Washington State has about 460. So Bangkok has more dispensaries than Starbucks and McDonald's and 7-Elevens combined.
Wow.
So
New
it's,
York State is just over 200 these days, so
yeah,
much
yeah.
more in Bangkok. Crazy.
So it just gives you a perspective like there is truly a dispensary on every block, if not more, in Bangkok. So it's interesting to see. It's interesting to see how they are sort of dealing with it. For the most part, they cater to tourists because they can get more money for the plant. Um, the tourists come out, they smoke on the street, which is not uh, really liked. The Thai nationals feel that's disrespectful, and the way it's done often is. So, there's sort of an uproar going right now, which leads me to believe that edibles, which are not legal, or beverages and other form factors, which are not legal, will be legal soon enough, which will allow people to consume on a discreet, in a more discreet manner. So truly interesting, but there's a big community. I've spoken at a number of conferences there. I just developed a brand and a dispensary in Phuket. So hopefully I'll be going to see that in March in person. And yeah, it's super exciting. And the things that are exciting there, as much as the rules and regulations are different, it's federally legal there. It's nationally legal there, which means that somebody can grow flower in Chiang Mai and ship it down to Phuket. with no problems whatsoever, meaning it moves through the country easily and can be exported as well, versus the US where cannabis cannot cross state lines. So so in some ways, even though we're really far ahead of them, and we are, um, there's so many advantages that they have and that they will take advantage of, which will really move that market ahead quickly.
Cool. And it's really fascinating. I know we don't have time to get into it today, but like, you mentioned the traditional history of it being medicine, which, cannabis has been used as medicine for thousands of years all over the world. Um, but in the more modern history, it's fascinating to me how, like the 70s, 80s, whatever, Thai sticks and Thai genetics and Thai cannabis was being imported, all over or exported all over the world, imported into the US certainly. And now we have this reverse dynamic where US cannabis allegedly is being exported to Thailand, and you have California brands or other brands that are, trying to get their product into Thailand. So it's just it's kind of amazing how the pendulum has swung, and how due to, you know, let's call it regulatory um arbitrage, that these things are kind of flipped on their heads in some ways. But anyway,
Yeah.
very very excited to see how global cannabis continues to develop. And I would love to, I got to join you one day to Bangkok for a study abroad, or research and development trip to see what the global market is looking like over there. But I want to shift gears again, Dave, because even though there's so much more I'd love to talk to you about this, I gotta ask you about your latest book, because
Mhm.
I think it's brilliant, and I think it's much needed, and I'm really excited, and I want to hear actually when we might expect to have it out, because I know we talked a little about branding bud. We didn't talk about your second book, which is your most recent book, which is also a very important book, Cannabis versus Marijuana, that talks about the language, and really dispels a lot of misconceptions and inaccurate uses of language that have become part of the culture and have become adopted because we've had a lack of education traditionally. And that's a whole other topic that, you know, we'll mention it. I do want to talk about it more, but I'm much more curious to talk about the book you're working on today, because you just shared this with me recently, and I'm again very excited about it. And if I'm not mistaken, the Cannabis Brand Licensing Bible. And
Correct.
I'm looking forward to worshiping at the Cannabis Licensing Church. Tell me about that book. Tell me about, the inspiration. Tell me about where you're at in the process, when we might expect to have that out, because I sense this is going to be an important and influential book for a lot of business owners. That's going to be a must-have. So tell me a little about that.
So the book is called the Cannabis Brand Licensing Bible, and let's just put that on hold for a minute. So when I came into the industry 13 years ago, um, I felt intuitively, and it was pretty obvious that cannabis, according to the rules, would not be able to cross state lines. So if cannabis brand owners were going to create national brands, they would need to somehow either build um, facilities, parallel facilities from state to state to state, which is what an MSO is, a multi-state operator, or they would need to license, which is very expensive and very costly and very hard to do. And that's why most of the MSOs, are backed by Wall Street. Then you have the smaller individual single state operators, SSOs, and or mom and pop shop operators that have built brands, but now they're looking to take those brands out to other states. How do they do that? Well, if they can't afford to create a whole new facility and hire a whole new team, they basically need to license that to somebody else. So that's what brand licensing is. And brand licensing is really allowing somebody else to make your cannabis brand and distribute it and sell it and look after it like it's your baby in another state. And to do it according to your SOPs, standard operating procedures. So 13 years ago, that was my idea. And the truth is, 13 years ago, most of the states that are on board now weren't even on board. And on top of that, most of the brands didn't even exist. And they were really treading water in their own states. Like, sure, somewhere in the back of their minds, they were thinking, one day I'll be a national cannabis brand, but they didn't really know how they were going to go about it. Fast forward 13 years later, after I've written my best-selling book on branding bud and on the language we use to talk about cannabis, I'm really at a place now where it's become clear that these brands are now ready and are already moving from state to state. Well, I'm a certified licensing specialist in the real world from my previous corporate branding and marketing background. I understand cannabis culture, cannabis product development, cannabis marketing, and go-to-market strategies. So really, the book is taking everything I know and everything I've done in the real world. I've cut licensing deals with fashion companies, the NBA, sports leagues, so on and so forth, and big sports companies and entertainment companies. So I understand how it works in the real world. And now what I'm doing is really codifying the process in a book. Because if people, brand owners, entrepreneurs really want to build their brands, then they need to understand what brand licensing is and and really how it affects their brand. Because the truth is, what you have and can do in one state, you may not be able to do in another state, whether it's a specific form factor or it's dosing. Take, for example, Washington State, a single serving is 10 milligrams of THC. In Massachusetts, it's 5. That's double the amount. In New Mexico, in the medical market, it's 50 megs of THC. That's 10 times the amount of Massachusetts. So how do you manage that? Again, certain child-resistant packaging, certain color palette rules and restrictions. So how do you manage a brand across multiple states, entering into different markets, but perhaps catering to different clientele, and managing that brand and getting the most out of it? That's what this new book will talk about, and that's the process that it goes through to to really prepare your brand, to get it ready to come up with. So that means, do you have SOPs? Do you have brand guidelines and all the other things? Getting it ready. Do you have a strategy? What states are you going into first? Why? What makes sense? Who are the competitors there? And I really call this, I'll call it threading the needle. And I'll use an example. If you have a chocolate brand in one state and want to take that chocolate brand to another state, that's awesome. But you will find your licensed manufacturer is also somebody capable of making chocolate because they make it for themselves. So now you have to find somebody that makes a chocolate brand that doesn't compete with your chocolate brand, right? So hopefully your chocolate brand is a value brand and their chocolate brand is a high-end brand. And and therefore they now can manufacture your chocolate where they manufacture their chocolate and bring it to a dispensary offering two different chocolates, more variety to the dispensary, that don't cannibalize each other and compete with each other. It's tricky.
Sure is. And similarly, writing a book is tricky. I know you and I have talked about this a lot. I'm just curious, where are you in the process? When do you have a expected or anticipated release date for this new book? Because I know I will certainly be ordering a copy. Um, yeah, I'm curious, where are you in that?
Well, I'm working through it right now. This is the first time I'm actually speaking about it in public. So,
Oh, world premiere.
yeah, so the book is about halfway done. I expect in July I will release it. I'm hoping I will release a couple of chapters before July, and then there'll also be workbooks, and those workbooks really help the entrepreneur better understand um, the anatomy of a licensing contract, understanding what a royalty is, understanding if that royalty is coming from net or gross proceeds. And what that does and what these workbooks do is basically help to figure out like, wow, if they sell $1 million worth of chocolate and I get 10% royalty, what does that really mean? And is it really worth going into that state or into other states and building out the national brand? It's I hate to say it, it's a dose of reality because I think a lot of cannabis brand owners are like, hey, I'm going to have a multi-million or billion-dollar, national cannabis chocolate company, and at the end of the day, they realize that that's almost impossible, or at least now. When federal legalization opens up, it will be a different story. You could have a one central factory, and you could ship you could ship product out just like M&Ms and Mars do. But until then, you really have to have more of a bottling company model, which is why Coke and Pepsi have bottling companies in every state, more actually in every state. Why? Because they don't want to ship heavy liquids across the country. But essentially, it comes down to the same model, which is you have one or more licensed facilities making your product in different states, and they have to follow the SOPs. In this case, so Coke is similar from one state to another, and that's what builds a brand, right? It's that consistent delivery and consistent promise.
Absolutely. And Dave, you've been consistent in your delivery today and giving us the promised education on cannabis branding and marketing. And I want to thank you for sharing your time and insights. And unfortunately, we're out of time today. I wish we had another hour. We're gonna have to bring you back for a part two because I feel like we just scratched the surface. But I want to thank you again for just sharing your time and wisdom. And I want to give you a chance to just make any closing statement or last words or share anything that we didn't get to today.
Yeah, well, the first thing is I just want to thank you for the opportunity, not only the opportunity to be here today, but the opportunity to teach at LIM. What you're doing is so important, and you've done some really great things for the community and for the students. And for that, I'm truly appreciative. Outside of that, just like you, I'm fighting for what makes sense and fighting for the normalization and acceptance of the plant. I do that through my writings. I do that through consulting, through speaking, and I plan to continue to do that in 2025. I can be reached via LinkedIn or at david@brandingbud.com. My website is brandingbud.com. And please feel free to reach out. And Michael, thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for being here, Dave. We'll talk soon, buddy.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is the cannabis business coach. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is the cannabis business coach.